Okay, thank you all for being here. We're gonna begin our chat with Nikola Petković, who is our Croatian guest for the festival. First of all, Nikola, how are you? Are you having a good festival so far?
Oh, it's great. It's my first. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's my first time in Malta, and I hope it's not my last time here. And I enjoy the festival. I enjoy the people, and thank you for inviting me here.
Okay, great. We're happy to have you. Just as I was happy to get a chance to read your first novel, which was given to me by the council a couple of months ago, and which I sped through, I think, in a couple of days. It's a painful read, but it's not a difficult one, which I think that tension between those two things is very telling of the nature of the book. Given that it's a very specific kind of book in a sense, but it's also a book that does, at least to me, harken back to certain, not to say classic, but certain established themes, shall we say. I was wondering if you could give us your definition of what the book is, because I have a couple of my own, but I don't want to color the discussion so early with my own preconceptions and prejudices. So I would rather hear it from you. So how would you describe How to Tie Your Shoes?
Well, I am anxious to hear your questions. This is the first book I wrote in English, actually. It's my third novel that originally was written in Croatian. And then, after a few years, I decided to do an English version, which I deliberately do not call a translation, because I was aiming at different audience, different readership. So what you have in Croatian, you don't have in English. It's a very personal story that it talks about very complicated relationship between me and my father. But, you know, I'm not the one who is in the book. It's a narrator, and the father is, of course, a character. But and he was a character, and it's a very personal, and it's the reason why well, first of all, I would probably be much happier if I've never had to write this book. I never had a desire to write this book. I never had a need to write this book. I almost felt I'm obliged to write this book, because the patriarchy in Croatia, where I come from, and in Yugoslavia, where these things were taking place before the 90s and then after the 90s in Croatia, it just comes with the territory. So many of our fathers, when they leave their houses, they're wonderful people. Everybody loves them. They go to the bar. They go to the movies. Everybody thinks they're great. In the house, most of them, I mean, not most of them, but some of them are house tyrants. And it just, for some reason, comes with the territory. People don't talk about this. And this is my first book that opened a different kind of readership back home, where I was giving some interviews for the national television or radio stations. For the first time, you know, people who were recording, people who were like gaffers, who were doing the light, they approached me, people who are not coming from these immediate literary circles, and said, "Hey man, what happened to you, it's nothing in comparison what happened to me. What my dad to me, I have 10 books to write." And I said, "Well, write them." So, and it's also funny, at the bookshelves back home, I found this in the self-help section, you know, how to tie your shoes, like I'm an idiot, like I can do that. But yeah, me and my father, my parents divorced when I was 7 years old, and the divorce itself is not a big deal, but the way how you communicate it to a child who is 7 years old, it is a big deal. I remember that the way I learned it, and it's very personal. I just came home one night, and instead of finding 3 plates at the dinner table, I found 2 plates at the dinner table. And I asked my mother, "Where's the dad?" "Well, he's not here." "Well, I'll wait for him until he comes, and then I will have my supper." And then she tells me, like, flat voice, "Well, I think you'll be hungry for many, many years." I said, "What the hell? What happened?" So they never communicated that divorce to me, and yeah, this was the night where I was probably more mature than they were. And this, for 2 years, I didn't know where my father was, and then I read in the newspaper that he had a car wreck, and that he barely survived the car wreck. So, when you put all these things together, this relationship is weird. So we were talking, communicating to each other on and off. He was not a necessarily bad person. He had a tough childhood. He was a World War II orphan. But who didn't have a tough childhood? He cannot be excused for the rest of your life to be an asshole. I mean, I'm sorry, if you had a tough childhood. So it's all about this. It's all about a relationship that actually never had so many possibilities to happen, to take place, but somehow it was absent. And the book has so many spins. It's not necessarily like a love and hate relationship, but it's a very complex relationship. It's longing for a father figure you never had, that can convince you to a point that you become so afraid to become a father yourself, because that model had perished at one point. And I remember starting to write this book in Croatian. I was in Shanghai, and my brother called me, and he told me that the father is in the hospital, diagnosed with a colon cancer. I haven't spoken to my dad for 2 years, so I took the flight. I went immediately to the hospital, and that's how we jump-started our conversation and our relationship, which immediately pissed me off. After 3 sentences, when I came to the hospital, I was angry with him again. I might, this very short part, maybe I can later even read it to you, but I'm sorry if I'm answering for... One of the mistakes I made, I was so naive when I was writing this book. I said, okay, I will write this. And after that, I will go through some kind of catharsis. He was dead when I finished. I could not finish this book. I was waiting for him to die to write the 3rd part of the book. But you know what? I was completely illiterate in basic psychoanalysis, because the trouble started when I had to promote this book. I could not go through this. I really could not take it. I had, when I was promoting it in Zagreb, in the Croatian capital, I was completely speechless. Everybody else had to talk. I was like zombified. Look, no, there is no catharsis here. So. Did I answer anything?
Yes, you did. I think that gives us a very clear, very immediate, and very emotional picture of what the book is about. But you talked about the failure of achieving catharsis, and that is really a frustration of expectations in some ways, at least of the powers of literature and so on. That makes me think of 2 things. I mean, the one thing that I alluded to earlier, which is the idea that this book, in some ways, maybe indirectly, perhaps even in an obvious way indirectly to you, but it does partake of a certain tradition, maybe even or a counter or a side tradition of literature, because there are lots of books actually about writers, or about male writers or male narrators, protagonists, confronting a dying patriarch. There is even a very good and very strong local example with Emmanuel Mifsud's In the Name of the Father and the Son, which you might have a chance to become familiar with in the coming days, perhaps. But I even think of something like Paul Auster's The Invention of Solitude, and that's what this made me think of. So, given that it was such obviously such an immediate and personal journey for you, did you ever at any point think about this as a literary product that also recalls a tradition?
Not really, because it was way too personal for me. It's like all of my other books are so different than this one, but it's very interesting that I didn't think about this. So of course, there's so many books written about dying patriarchs, about dying dictators who are father figures in a very monstrous ways. But there was one book that I had in the back of my mind, and this is a book written by Jamaica Kincaid. And the book is entitled The Autobiography of My Mother. And she has this incredible beginning, saying, I will paraphrase it, I cannot quote it because I read it long ago. My mother died the day I was born, so ever since there was nothing to stand between me and eternity. And the very title, The Autobiography of My Mother, brings you to the point that autobiography as a genre is always a biography of somebody else, because it's mediated through language, and even if you want to present yourself, to a large extent, you have to present yourself in the eyes of the other. And as much as this book is about my father, it's also about me, because the frighteningly, the very, very, what is, at some point, when you have to reread this in this editing process, and when I spoke to my younger brother, we're actually similar. And what frightened me, at some points, I started to remind myself of my father. So what's going on with me? So it's also some kind of self-reflection, I would say.
Yeah, so maybe if it wasn't cathartic, it was psychologically useful in other ways, or enlightening maybe in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, but as I said in the beginning, it was, I was very surprised how in the Balkans, how very many books are written where you expose yourself and your father, and this some kind of patriarchy in the family, where a woman is an object, and he's the big master of everything, but completely in the domesticized way. When he leaves the house, he's like somebody different. And also, what was interesting, the book got good reviews in Croatia, in Slovenia. It got terrible reviews in Serbia, because how can somebody betray the father? No.
Yeah.
With mother you can do whatever you want, but don't touch the father. It's a father figure. Yeah. I said, oh, after all, those Serbs. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah.
No, I really got this. The one guy totally, he tore me apart. He said, only a coward who couldn't grow up can write something about his dead father.
Right.
Something
yeah, so
like
it was an immoral book.
Yeah. I mean, it was reading into it, but also confirming the fact that the book should have been written because the patriarchy exists even in literary criticism.
Yeah. And that leads up to the other question I want to ask, because clearly then as you read the book, you weave in the various tensions and fallouts of the Yugoslav wars and all of that. That is something that it comes across in a very humorous way, but does also stem from the relationship with the father in many ways. Your reflections on it do expand from all that. I mean, some of your observations are even things that I myself obviously recognize. Yeah. The farce of the shifting borders and of how, you know, I used to be Yugoslav, now I'm Serb, or now I'm Bosnian, and then you remember that you actually had a Bosnian grandmother or things like that. Was this something would you say that this is something that stems from the relationship with the father in terms of the drama of the book particularly, or were these things you wanted to explore in a literary sense anyway?
You mean the things of this identitarian?
Yes, yes, yes.
No, and it also it stems out of my father's behavior. As yesterday at the conference we brushed upon the point of identity, and a very interesting thing happened to my father, which is actually very sad. My father was, I don't know how familiar you are with the recent history of the former Yugoslavia, but we had a civil war and a war in the 90s. And people in Croatia, my father was a Bosnian Serb living in Croatia. He came as a 16-year-old and he decided to stay there. So when it became dangerous to be Serbian in Yugoslavia, he reinvented his identity, so he became a Montenegrin. It was less dangerous. Yeah. But he also, I think he had some kind of narcissistic problem with he used to confabulate a lot. So I never knew. He had three versions of his childhood. One was he grew up in orphanages in the Dalmatian coastal city of Split. The other one, he grew up in Doboj in Bosnia. The third one, he was in Maglaj in Bosnia. So, you know, it was like a pick and choose, whatever, you know, which of the childhoods are more interesting to you. But, and this Montenegrin thing was the funniest. He felt that Yugoslavia is going to fall apart. It was in 1986, 87. So he picked up all the family, him, his wife, and my younger brother, because then I was a teenager who didn't want to travel with my parents anymore. So they went to Montenegro. Mm-hmm. And it's funny that he spoke this really thick Bosnian accent. And I assume nobody here speaks any of the Yugoslavian languages, right? So it doesn't really, or somebody does? It doesn't really make sense. So there is this Petar Petrović Njegoš, who is a great poet of the Montenegro, who wrote the book The Mountain Wrath, which I always read as the Slavic Montenegrin Orthodox manual for slaughtering Muslims. It was this heroic, epic story, but all the bad guys were Turks. You know, it's oversimplified thing, and all the heroes were the Orthodox people. So, okay, I didn't like the book ever. So, they're driving up the Lovćen mountain, where there is a mausoleum dedicated to Petar Petrović Njegoš, great writer. So on the way up, my father speaks with thick Bosnian accent. Then he sees this mausoleum, and he completely changes, you know. He completely snaps, and on the way down, he starts talking in Montenegrin accent, telling my younger brother, I've never told you we're Montenegrins. And my younger brother was 9-year-old, and he figured out something is wrong. Something is really going wrong. So Of course, you can use that as a synecdoche to explain all this insanity of ethnic conflicts and these identity issues, which of course, what Eric Hobsbawm would say, it's always the invention of tradition. It's always a posteriori. Every history is, I don't want to generalize, but every history known to me, it's a patriarchal myth of victory and freedom. There is no objective history. If I ever happen to open a history book that will say, we're a bunch of idiots who came to a beautiful country and managed to screw up everything we encountered, I would read it as objective history. No, we came there, we're victims. There was these other people, they attacked us. You know,
Yeah.
this self-pity, and they're always right.
Yeah.
And these are the stories I was growing up with, and it was by describing my father's way to practically save himself in the growing nationalism in Croatia, country he chose to live in, and reinventing his identity as Montenegrin. It's very sad, but again, it also then brought me to some kind of a higher level, like more general level, where I was in more almost like essayistic ways writing about all this insanity of breaking up the country in the name of multiplying identities and othering your immediate neighbors. Because the basic definition, like I remember, I'm sorry, this is some kind of a footnote to I did my PhD on Central European literatures and cultures, and I was sent in a field research. I had some stipend by Soros at the time. So with my students, my American students at the time, I was asking people in Croatia, what does it mean to be a Croatian? And just I was repeating it and repeating it. Please tell me, what does it mean to be Croatian? 80-some% of the answers were, first of all, don't you know?
Yeah.
Second of all, hey, don't you F with me. The third was, you know what? Doesn't matter. I'm so happy I'm not Serb. So, you know, I am the one who has my neighbor failed to become.
Yeah.
This is insane.
We got there first. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you mentioned the sort of the essayistic format, as you called it, and the book itself is it is in some ways a hybrid of personal memoir with maybe some hints of a let's call it an established storytelling traditions and so on. Given that you are obviously active in different literary fields, both as a writer, as an academic, and as a poet as well. For this particular story, that as we have just discussed, is encompassing so many different things that are both personal and national and universal. Did you find this form to be particularly accommodating because of the inherent hybridity of it? Was this something that you maybe discovered as you were writing even?
It was something I discovered as I was writing, and it has 3 parts to it. And I wrote 2 parts quite quickly. It's a short novel. Yeah. And then the third one was the most difficult one that writes about the nature of writing. When my father dies, in this part I write, and now it's so easy to visit him because he's at the cemetery and I don't have to listen to him anymore, and I can be there as much as I want, and I will never be giving some lectures. And but also I had this idea of a lost keychain to my car. It happens once when I was driving to the cemetery and did some kind of repeating movements, like repeating it in a language. It was really it developed as I was writing, which is funny. But another some kind of very traditional ways of reading literature in Croatia. This book came in, I think the Croatian version came in 2011 or something, and it was shortlisted for every possible prize in Croatia. I was among the 5 finalists, and there was always an argument, this is not a novel.
All right, yeah.
You know, this is not a novel. I mean, okay, if it were your novel, as a critic, I would argue it vigorously. I can't argue my own text.
Yes.
But I said, how can you mean? The novel is a genre that survived for centuries.
Yes.
The novel survived because it's so protean.
Yeah.
It changes.
Yes.
Of course, it's not a novel the way a jury who decides imagines it. So this is this hybridity, or you're talking off. I was shifting from a voice to a voice. Even if I can say I'm the narrator throughout the novel, but the way I'm approaching the topic, it kind of changes perspectives and changes even genres within
the same text,
very short, very brief.
Yes.
And we are talking about Croatian version. We're not talking about this one.
Yes. Which, again, that is something that I've really been itching to ask you. How you described it, that the English version isn't just a translation; it's actually a whole new version of the book for you. We often hear as a sort of truism that an author should not translate their own work, just like they shouldn't they should always work with an editor and not edit their own book. And even filmmakers should get an editor to edit the final cut, to have that distance, that critical distance, that perspective. So was this one of the reasons why you decided to go for a more radical change? And how much of it, in fact, changed? I mean, when you say it's a different version, do you say the events of the book are different, or is it simply a matter of tone, or certain metaphors, linguistic choices? Like, on what level is it different? How is it different?
It's different because, first of all, I don't know when did I decide it, and I think it was either crazy or a brave decision when I lived in the States for almost 15 years, and I decided to write in English. And I came back in 2003 in Croatia. So really, I'm not using English for so many years. It used to be so much better than it's now. And when I came back to Croatia, it was better than my Croatian, because Croatian has changed in the meantime. When I was there, Every translation, I believe it's, and it's not only my belief, it's one of the interpretations of translation, is a cultural adaptation. You adapt it to a culture you're trying to address. Also, you asked me about the events. Like in Croatia or in Yugoslavia, everybody knew what was to become a Tito's pioneer. Josip Broz Tito was the president of Yugoslavia, and he was until he died. We had elections, but we had only one name to circle, and it was Josip Broz Tito. So you circle it, and it's funny when Tito came to the States, and he told to John Kennedy, he said, "What kind of president are you? They have to vote every 4 years for you to remain the president. You're not powerful enough." So, at the age of 7, we were all becoming Tito's pioneers. They give you red bandana, they put you a blue hat, and they give you a red star, and you have to repeat some stupidities about, I will respect my parents, I will be Tito's pioneer, and I will... And it was one of the most traumatic experiences I had After I told you in the beginning that I haven't seen my father for 2 years. And the first time I saw him after 2 years, he was a party official, a communist party official, a low range. But in the small coastal city of Bakar near Rijeka, where I grew up, where I was becoming a Tito's pioneer, he was the one who was in charge of accepting us to the Tito's pioneers. So I haven't seen my father for 2 years, and there is him stepping on the stage, shaking my hand and telling me, "Congratulate you, now you are the pioneer." Like, what the hell? Yeah. Why do you have to do this? Yeah. So when you do it for a Croatian version, this part about becoming Tito's pioneer has 5 lines. Mm. When you do it for the American readership, it has to have 5 pages because they have no clue what it is. Or when I write about my American experience in this book, it's very, very short in my American version, and it's long in my Croatian version. Yeah. So, but the lexic, vocabulary, content really hasn't changed. It kind of, at some points it shrank, at some points it expanded, but more or less...
it was mostly contextual information.
Yes, as I said, a cultural adaptation. And you want people to understand what does it mean. If I were to write, I became Tito's pioneer, what is it? You know?
Yes. Yeah, it's a practical concern as well, which is part of writing too, of course. Wondering if you have any passages you would like to read from the book. I don't want to put you on the spot here, but if you had anything. My copy is helpfully dog-eared because not only for practical reasons, but because I found some of the passages quite compelling. And by the way, this dog-earing caused controversy when my sister posted it on social media. A lot of people were up in arms against the dog-earing books because that ruins the purity of the book, apparently. But yeah.
Would you like me? Did you have?
Yeah. Well, you kind of ruined a bit about Njegoš, though. I was hoping you would have given it to us straight from the source, but.
But can I just do this first two short ones?
Yes, please.
Which I announced when I came back from Shanghai to see my father in the hospital. After 2 years, we haven't talked to each other. It goes, "Dad's going to die soon. My brother and I are standing beside his hospital bed. I've never been sick," he says. "I used to come here to see those who are sick. Now I'm here alone, all by myself. Only and with you. And you don't need me anymore. You are both grown up now." Indeed we are. We grew up. My brother's 36. He works with computers. Some weird subspecialization, he told me. There are only 3 of them who do this stuff in the entire country. He studied psychology and he dropped it. I have no idea whether he replaced it with anything else, other than computers. Perhaps he never cared for it to begin with. We seldom talk, except for the moments when fathers die. He's married and has a son. I'm 45. I'm 56 now. I'm a university professor. Unlike my brother, I never had the courage to quit anything. I have a son too. I'm also married. We're both grown-ups, big boys, tall. Dad's not tall anymore. He's rather long now. There are 3 bags hanging by his bed. One is full of blood, one is full of urine, one is full of nothing. Once he dies, I will place him inside this 3rd empty one. So this is the first part.
Yeah.
And did you want me to read this?
Yes. Go ahead. Yes. It's a fun one. And it ties into what we were talking about identity even yesterday.
It's so beautiful when your father is dying. Then you can suddenly tell stories like this. like this one to everyone without even thinking about what effect they'll have on listeners. What could possibly be heavier and more real than your father's death? What is a story, regardless of its content, in comparison with your father's death? In Bosnia, from where a few years before I was born, my father, being a Boy Scout, came to Bakar. Whenever they want to say can, they actually say you are allowed to. And možeš, right? So not only could I have said anything I wanted to, but according to the word choice, I was also allowed to do so. Now when I'm allowed to say whatever I want, I return to memories and activate those among them I didn't dare to share before. I was actually afraid to talk in front of him. Here is a benign one. My father claimed he was a Bosnian all his life, until one summer in the late 80s, one of the last peaceful and quiet summers before the war tore Yugoslavia apart, smashing it into pieces. He went on a trip. He must have had a feeling that his country would vanish soon, and he had the need to see its entirety for the last time. While coming down the Lovćen mountain, where there is a mausoleum with a big sculpture of the great Montenegrin writer, intellectual, and poet Petar Petrović Njegoš, my father identified with his greatness and glory that dwell in that holy place and decided to become a Montenegrin himself. Suddenly, it sounded more appealing to him than his former Bosnian identity. He did it because he could. He was allowed to choose. And aside from living in a world of his own creation his whole life, there was some beauty in the identity swap he made that day. Ethnic affiliation. That identification, actually mistaken for identity, is involuntarily by default. It comes with the territory. It has to do with your heritage, place of birth, language, roots, and has nothing to do with your free will. And that's exactly what my father swapped that day. He became a Montenegrin because he identified with the greatest icon of its culture, Petar Petrović Njegoš, the ruler, the writer, the intellectual. And I wanted to tell you this one too. If I were to embrace my Bosnianness that includes some Montenegrin elements incorporated in my sense of self by my father's choice, then the story about my fucking in the hay, well, this is a story from before, should go like this. Oh, how beautiful it is when your father dies. Then you're allowed to say out loud even words like hers. Fuck that lame pussy poet of yours. He didn't know how to put it in, so I had to do it all by myself. And you can even do it in public without thinking about the consequences. In the end, I didn't go to Bosnia with my family as my father planned. I fucked up again. And that Njegoš guy, he wasn't all that great. His epic poem, A Mountain Rat, describes the heroism of the Orthodox Montenegrin tribe protecting the bulwark of Christianity against the bestial Ottoman Turks. This is the official version. In reality, it's a manual for genocide filled with bloody descriptions of violence that promote hate while trying to market it as a self-defense. And rumor has he died of syphilis. I think he overdosed on identity.
I love that passage so much. Would you say that in some ways this is also a bitter book? Because that's a strand that I saw throughout. There is clearly a sense of bitterness. Now, would you say that this is simply part of the territory that you are negotiating or navigating through in this particular book? And was it something subconscious, or maybe something you wanted to confront directly?
Well, definitely, yeah, it is. There is a bitterness in this book, but one of the presenters, my first book reading in Zagreb in Croatia, she said, she's a very, very good critic, And she said that in this book there is so much bitterness and so much unfulfilled love, so much desire for things that could have happened but never happened.
Yeah.
So it's not really a bitter book against my father. It's also some kind of what I said at the beginning of our conversation here. I would have been so much happier person had I never had to write this. So you have a bit of course, bitterness, but also a bit of love that I never was able to utter while he was alive.
Yeah. And even though you said you didn't feel any immediate catharsis necessarily immediately after you wrote it or immediately after it was published, and even though the initial promotional tour, as you said, was painful to you for understandable reasons as well, now that some years have passed, how do you look on this book? And are you feeling at least some runoff, positive psychological runoff in the wake of it?
I tend not to think of this book that much anymore, but I haven't written anything in English after this book.
Right.
So I just finished my new novel. It's also a family story, but it's about my grandparents, and it starts with the Italian occupation of Croatian coast. And it ends with 1945, with the liberation, and it's a story about ordinary people. I think we're all ordinary. Even the prime minister who is up there is ordinary.
Yes.
I hope. So I don't know. He does the same thing I do. He eats. He goes to sleep.
Yeah, sure,
so,
sure.
I will stop here. So it's about Italian soldiers, about German soldiers, about the partisans, about the civilians between 1940 and 1945. When I'm trying to tell this small histories, this counter memories that basically in the official histories, at the end of the event, you always have somebody, you have victors and you have those who lose. But I think what Walt Whitman said in one of his poems in the Leaves of Grass is great. You know, there is no winner after the war. Everybody loses something or somebody. So this is something, the book that I'm very much involved with now. And my grandmother, she was the survivor of the greatest concentration camp in Italy, Gonars. And of course, she never spoke about this. But I tend, like now, when we talk about this, I hope I'm not too emotional. Years ago, I was barely able to speak. But also, when I shifted from Croatian into English, I can't feel it that emotionally in English as I can feel it in my native language.
Yeah, it makes intuitive sense, yes. Yeah. And your new book sounds fascinating, and I hope we'll get a chance to speak about that too when the English translation comes out as well, or adaptation.
I hope it will, and I hope Italians are interested in it, because it's fascinating how few things are written about Gonars, historically and fictionally. And the book is scheduled to come out, I think, in 10 days.
Okay.
So,
Okay. So.
In Croatian.
Yes. Sure. Yeah. But it's done from your end. For now.
Yeah.
Okay, Nikola. Thank you very much for this conversation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. And we hope to see you again soon. I'm sure.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me again.
Okay.
Thanks.